Good evening, everybody. I'm Megan Torrey, the Chief Executive Officer of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this important talk on avoiding a forever war, what escalation between Israel and Iran means for the U.S. And before we start tonight, before we begin our discussion, I wanted to acknowledge the moment that we're at, that we've all been through a divisive election season, and today is a significant day in our nation's history. I want to thank everyone for being here as part of this community and for making time to discuss this issue with us tonight. I've heard from many of you today, and I've spent most of the morning on calls with you, and it's nice to see some of you here today. And you've expressed to me how scared you are, how you feel attacked, and how important this today what means to you. I want to reaffirm to you the mission of the World Affairs Council. We exist as an organization to help people better understand what happens in the world, even and especially in tumultuous times. While our nation is deeply divided, I want to affirm that this organization remains steadfastly committed to our mission and our beliefs. We believe that all humans should be treated with dignity and respect, no matter their gender, race, origin, who they love, or what they may look like. We believe that our neighbors are not our enemies, and that we can disagree respectively and hold different opinions and still have civility. We believe that engaging and learning about the world is a true act of patriotism. We will continue to be a trusted source of truth and reliable information on how we can navigate this complex world together. We will always be here for you. We've been here for you for 100 years, and we will continue our work with integrity and respect for all. And we thank you for making the council the community that it is. Now, without further ado, tonight we're welcoming Dr. Trita Parsi. Trita Parsi is executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations and author of 3 books on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Trita, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure, as always.
If you're here on Zoom, I want to invite you to join the conversation in the chat, and I see that you've already done that. I want to please introduce yourself, let everyone know where you're coming in from tonight, and be part of the conversation. And to ask Trita a question tonight, please submit your question through the Q&A icon. We want as many of your questions as possible. So Trita, let's jump right in. Can you please set the scene for us? This is an ongoing and escalating conflict. On Saturday, Iranian officials promised that they will be making a retaliatory strike against Israel in response to Israel's attack on October 26th that targeted military bases and other locations and killed at least 5 people. Can you please tell us the latest on the situation and where it stands this week?
Let's start off from where we are now. We can work backwards. We are now in a situation in which the decibel and the chatter from the Iranian side is really intensifying, and increasingly it looks like they will do some sort of a retaliation against Israel. And there was actually a lot of chatter that suggested that they might have done it last night on election night. I think, frankly, there is a likelihood, a risk that this may happen within the next 2 weeks, precisely because Trump won. I'm not saying that it wouldn't have happened otherwise, but I think there's an added element here. There is a narrative that the Israelis have pushed for, that they are pushing on to the Trump administration, which is to say, look, it wasn't that risky or costly to strike Iran. Iran's S-300 and air defenses are now destroyed. Iran has no ears, no eyes left. So let's just finish this job. This is not costly. And look, we've already decimated Hamas. We're decimating Hezbollah. This is just shifting the balance of power in the region in a really good and neat way. And it doesn't cost that much. If that, and the reason why that argument has some sensitivity is because while Trump has an image of being negative towards wars, doesn't want to start new ones, he's also someone who, if he actually thinks that the cost is low, may be convinced to do something. And this then creates a scenario in which the Iranians may feel like, well, if the perception is that the cost is low, the way to change the perception is to raise the cost. And you raise the cost by doing another attack on Israel. The last one was on October 1st, about 180 missiles that struck were used by the Iranians. A very large number of them did strike Israel. And if you go on Twitter, you can see the images. You can see clearly that the Israeli air defenses did not work. And it's after that that the Israelis asked for the US to deploy a battery of the THAAD missiles in Israel. This would not have been requested nor been offered had the Iranian strikes not been successful. Now, they also only struck military sites, and to the best of our knowledge, there were no casualties. The reporting seems to indicate that there wasn't much damage, but we have to treat that with a degree of a pinch of salt because the Israelis don't allow for any reporting on the damage that has been done. There's military censorship. In fact, an American journalist that was reporting on it was jailed for several days by the Israelis for having done so. So I do suspect that actually there was some damage. I don't know how significant, but enough to warrant the Israelis asking for the THAADs before they struck Iran on the 26th, as you mentioned. This whole thing started on April 1st, when the Israelis struck the Iranian consular section of the embassy they have in Damascus. This is obviously a major breach of international law to strike a diplomatic compound. And the Iranians responded a couple of weeks or days later, 2 weeks later, with a barrage of drones and missiles, etc. Again, no casualties. 9 of the missiles at that time penetrated Israel's air defenses. The Israelis struck again, but it was a very limited strike, and the Iranians more or less pretended as if nothing had happened. And then they moved on, and we had about 4 months of silence. But then, and the Iranians said that they would strike again, but then didn't because they were waiting essentially because the US said that we were close to a ceasefire deal, don't mess it up. There was no ceasefire deal. The Iranians believed that they were actually duped by the Biden administration, and then they decided to strike on October 1st, particularly after the Israelis took out the head of the Lebanese Hezbollah, in which also a senior Iranian was assassinated, Iranian general was assassinated. None of this, however, would be happening if there had been a ceasefire in Gaza. And if the Biden administration had imposed one early on. This is not about negotiating one. This is about imposing one because the US has the leverage to do so. But as long as the Biden administration has tolerated that war and the massive civilian casualties, then we have continued to see a steady escalation in the region. Now, the Israelis are deep inside of Lebanon as well, and massive destruction happening there, a lot of people being killed there as well. So if you just take it back of how things have evolved since October 7th, it's been a steady escalation. And as a result, it's also unfortunate and not surprising that at some point it would involve Israel and Iran directly. The question now, of course, is with Trump there, will the Iranians act? Will they, show some restraint? Is Israel incentivized to show restraint, or does Israel interpret the Netanyahu election as a green light for them to escalate further, to go beyond just the Lebanon, Syria, and Iran? And it remains to be seen. It very much depends on what Trump says in the next couple of days, and also who Trump decides to bring into his national security team.
There's so many questions I can follow up with. One of the things that we're talking about tonight is, the U.S. and its potential to get involved in a forever war, right? When we look back at the last 24 years, 20 to 21 of them, we were involved in, protracted conflict in the region. When you look at those 100 troops deployed in Israel to operate that the terminal high altitude area defense missile system, what's your assessment of this move? Does this sort of creep the U.S. into more into possibility of entering conflict?
I think it does. And I think we have to be very honest about the fact that while the Biden administration says that they have done these things to de-escalate the situation, reality is that they're reducing the cost for Israel to escalate. If the Israelis didn't have the THAAD system, it would be riskier and more dangerous for them to strike Iran, and they would have caused them to think twice. In fact, it may have led to a situation in which they would have interpreted as being cost prohibitive. But by reducing the cost for Israel to escalate, by protecting them against the consequences of their own escalation, we're actually incentivizing the Israelis to escalate further. So I think on that front, it's extremely problematic. On another front, we're putting 100 American troops in the middle of an active war zone. If any one of them are killed, which is not an insignificant likelihood or risk, then we're dragged into that war as well, because then there's going to be massive pressure on Biden to strike. And given what he's done so far, I don't think he would be able to resist that pressure. Then you have another problem. There may be a scenario in which the Biden administration now, after the elections, feeling completely screwed over by Netanyahu and the manner in which Netanyahu clearly wanted Trump to win, that he decides that, okay, at this point, enough is enough. I'm actually going to, I'm not going to stop arms sales, etc., but I'm not going to support Israel militarily when it's doing these different things. And as a result, desire to pull back the THAADs. But in this scenario, if you actually pull out the THAADs, that actually could be an escalatory move, because it could almost be seen as a green light to Iran to strike as well. Because now those protective anti-defense missiles are no longer there. So this is part of the reason why it's so, you have to think through carefully if you're ever going to put those missiles there, because pulling them out can be an extremely dangerous move as well. And I don't think that these things were thought through particularly effectively. There was a lot of patting themselves on their back in April when, and I think the administration deserves credit for how they managed the choreography of what happened between Iran and Israel back in April, in which after about a round and a half of strikes, they all stopped. But I wrote a piece in the New York Times in which I argued that that was a tactical success within a strategic failure, because we should not be in a situation in which these countries are on the brink of war. If we actually push for a real ceasefire, we would be pulling the entire region away from the brink of war. We cannot expect to get lucky every time. And lo and behold, 6 months later, you had another exchange of fire, and this time a deadly one. And as it looks right now, if nothing else changes, there's going to be another exchange of fire within weeks or months, and it's likely going to be much more ferocious than the previous one. So we're still on an escalatory cycle, because whatever the Biden administration has done has only tactically pushed things back, not strategic.
Let's talk a little bit about the U.S. role in negotiations and its sort of negotiating power in the region. And I see there's so many questions coming into the chat. I'll just ask that you put them in the Q&A. But so as the U.S. sort of works to negotiate a ceasefire, we had Bill Burns here not too long ago, who was, leaving us to get on a plane to go to the Middle East. How would you describe U.S. influence at the negotiating table? Do we know what, if any, red lines are, the U.S. has in negotiations? How would you describe, characterize our participation?
Bill Burns is a masterful negotiator and probably the best American diplomat of his generation, and a national treasure in many different ways. However, no diplomat can perform better than the leeway that he is given. And I don't believe that the administration gave Burns the necessary leverage to be able to get a deal, because the administration constantly adjusted their position to correspond with what Netanyahu would find acceptable. And Netanyahu's interest was not to get a deal. And this is very openly discussed in Israel, that Netanyahu had an interest in continuing the war, even at the expense of losing the hostages. At first, because the minute the war would end, his political career would end, and he may also end up in jail as a result of the corruption charges against him. So he had an interest in keeping the war going. Then he had now had a couple of tactical military successes against Hamas with the killing of Sinwar and Hania, as well as, of course, with the killing of the head of Hezbollah in Nasrallah. And that actually pushed Israeli public opinion more in his favor. In fact, he is at least prior to the firing of Galant, he was more popular amongst the Israeli public than he had been at any point since October 7th. So the strategy actually worked out very well for him. Hostages are not out. Tons of them have been killed, lost, and many of them have been killed inadvertently by the Israelis themselves. But nevertheless, he was in a more popular position since October 7th because he had continued the war and he had managed to get a couple of successes. So the strategy worked out for him. And this has been crystal clear to the Biden administration, but they never dared to put pressure on Netanyahu and put his back against the wall and force a ceasefire. And I think at one point in July of this year, they became close to doing that. And that's when Harris took the ticket and she had her first press conference with Netanyahu. The body language was very cold. And she also said specifically to him in front of the cameras, take the deal. It may not sound as if it means a lot, but it actually means a lot. It means you are what's upholding the deal. The deal is at your feet. We're waiting for your signature, not Hamas's signature. And so she called him out. But that got a ferocious response from the Israelis. And ever since, you saw Kamala Harris backing off and just adopting the same line as the Biden administration, which in certain parts of the country certainly seems to have had the impact of costing her those elections in those localities, at least.
So we discussed a little bit about the Biden administration before, but let's talk about how the election of Donald Trump might impact the issue. Do we know how a Trump presidency might approach the conflict? I know we're in early days, but we're also hearing reports from NPR that they say Israel has indicated that they'll end the wars, right? If due to Donald Trump's election, what do we have to make of that?
It's obviously going to be very difficult to tell, and I think we shouldn't. Let me separate the question in two different ways. If we just assume that Trump himself makes a decision, what would happen? And if we then have to take into account that Trump is not the lone decision maker here, it's going to have to be Trump plus his advisors. That makes a huge difference. So in the second question, it all depends on who he brings in. If he brings in the same team as he had before, which I don't think is likely, but nevertheless, there may be some holdovers. He may very well end up in the same scenario as before, in which a lot of these foreign policy things in which he wanted to do something unconventional, he would be sabotaged by his own advisors. So, he really wanted to get out of Syria. He almost lost the deal of getting out of Afghanistan. John Bolton did everything he could to sabotage any deal with the North Koreans, etc. So if we set that aside and just say, okay, what would Trump do? I find it very interesting that Trump could, during the campaign season, say, I want the killing to stop. But Harris seemed to find difficulty saying something that otherwise I think should be as benign and unobjectionable as just simply saying, I want the killing to stop. It's almost a line from a beauty pageant. No one can object to it. It's that safe. Yet she couldn't say it. And Trump did. And I don't think he's just saying it because he recognized that actually polls well. But I think also there is a track record of him not favoring war, but more than anything else, really being sensitive about being dragged into someone else's war, not being in control of the situation, not ending up in these forever war situations in which the cost of pulling out is going to be so overwhelming. And I think the Israelis are actually quite sensitive about that. There is a narrative out there that I think by and large is definitely true. The current Israeli government absolutely wanted Trump to win, but they're also very nervous about him because they also know that if he at some point decides enough is enough, I don't want to see any more of this. When I become president on January 21, whatever it is, I want this to be over with by then. It's actually much costly for the Israelis to ignore that, because I think Netanyahu is much more sensitive about crossing Trump than he was about crossing Biden. He almost took pleasure in crossing Biden, and Biden did hardly anything about it. That's not the psychology of Trump. So I think the Israelis now may be signaling that they want to end the war, etc., precisely because a recognition that will play well with Trump. They don't want to be seen as the ones that are keeping the war going.
And so, yeah, so let's talk a little bit. I'm going to bring in a question here from our colleague Jim Falk from Santa Fe. So when you talk about the administration's ability to force a deal, can you prioritize and or rank the steps the administration could have, should have taken to help sort of force a deal?
So let's just start off by something that I think is it's kind of silly that there actually was a debate about this. Like, do we have leverage over Israel? Biden has shipped over 50,000 tons of weapons to Israel since the start of the war. The Israelis could not conduct this war for more than about 3 or 4 weeks without the constant replenishment of weapons and ammunition from the Biden administration. And there was ample opportunities of saying enough is enough, go about it a different way. And if not, you're on your own. You can do it, but you're not going to do it with our weapons and us paying for it because it's the American taxpayers that are paying for it. It's not a question of whether the leverage existed or not. It's a question of whether the leverage was going to be used because the administration had the backbone of using it. And I think what they really, really feared is that they would put pressure on Netanyahu, and then Netanyahu would be openly campaigning for Trump by accusing the administration of abandoning Israeli security. As you know, for about a couple of weeks, they held up deliveries of 2,000-pound bombs. And Netanyahu went very aggressive and essentially blasted the administration and said that it's abandoning Israel. And there was a lot of fear of how that would be affecting the elections. I personally think it was always an exaggerated sensitivity, but the administration was very sensitive to that. So I think withholding the weapon shipments was an obvious step. Moreover, there was no reason to issue, 3 vetoes in the UN Security Council, blocking calls for a ceasefire. Incidentally, those resolutions condemned Hamas, condemned terrorism, and demanded the release of the Israeli hostages as well. We still veto these things. So we provided political and diplomatic protection for Israel to continue to do what it was doing, while providing weapons for them that enabled them to do this, while disregarding American law that said that you're not allowed, for instance, to provide these weapons if massive human rights abuses are taking place, if the country in question is blocking aid, particularly American aid, which the evidence was overwhelming that the Israelis were doing internally in the State Department, although when presenting it to Congress, Secretary Blinken decided to say something different, which was frankly not true. So there's been plenty of opportunities, and I think it is a tremendous disfavor to not only the region, to the Israelis, to the Palestinians, of course, but also to the US, because the rest of the world sees this. And they see what's going on. They see that there's a genocide complaint against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And we're enabling this to continue. This is hurting the US's standing internationally. The US is currently as isolated at the UN on these issues and beyond, frankly, as Russia has been on Ukraine, which is not a position the United States should be in. For instance, just about 2-3 weeks ago, the Biden administration decided not to run for a second term on the Human Rights Council in Geneva out of a fear that it actually would lose the election because of the international outrage at the United States for the massive human rights abuses that are taking place in Gaza with our weapons and with our support. This is a really embarrassing and an isolated position for the United States to be in. There's no reason why we should pay the cost of that, because there is no US national interest that is at stake in this to the extent that it would justify these sacrifices. It's one thing to say, yes, from a US standpoint, would like to see Hamas defeated. But we're not talking about defeating Hamas. We're talking about leveling Gaza. which I mean, just take a look at the images of how massive parts of it is now completely destroyed, flattened. Um, I'm very worried about what the judgment of history is going to be about this episode 10 years from now, when even more evidence will come forward of the massive amount of deaths. Because remember, when we're talking about 43,000 deaths, those are just the deaths that the authorities in Gaza have been able to confirm because the people have been brought to the hospital, been declared dead, and counted as a result. The number of people that are under the rubble, according to some medical journals, is probably going to be in the neighborhood of 200,000 plus. And the vast majority of them are going to be women and children.
As we look to the U.S., potentially getting into another forever war, I'm going to ask you to assess some of the potential pathways that we see. I'm going to present three scenarios, and if you could sort of comment on their potential, your assessment of their potential to lead the U.S. into a forever war. Let's start with the U.S. deployment of troops and commitment creep in the region. So we know we have the 100 troops on the ground, but we have about 34,000 U.S. military personnel in the region. And we know that so many U.S. Navy ships as well. So what is the potential for, U.S. troop deployment and commitment creep in the area?
I think the most dangerous things are that by allowing the steady escalation, we will end up getting dragged in because either there's going to be militias or others who will attack US troops. And once you actually have American deaths in combat, the US, remember what happened at the base on the border of Jordan, and the US, obviously retaliated after that. You have something larger than that happening, and you will see the US get dragged into the war. You may also have a scenario in which the Israelis escalate further vis-a-vis Iran. The Iranians respond very harshly, and Israel is actually in a very jeopardized situation, and the pressure will be on the United States to actually step in. A person inside the US government mentioned that in the absence of the protection the US has given Israel in terms of not only the THAADs, but even short of that, a lot of other resources that the US has sent there and helped shoot down Iranian missiles. In the absence of that, a confrontation between Iran and Israel actually would not win. So the pressure on the US to actually get involved if the war escalates and the Israelis are actually facing consequences much worse than they have faced so far is another pathway. And again, this is part of the reason I think that whether one has any sympathy with the Palestinians or not, which I don't think Biden had, and I don't suspect Trump will have either, at a minimum, recognizing that the escalation risks dragging the US into the war. And it's clearly not in our interest to be dragged into yet another war in the region. That should be enough to justify an effort to actually force a ceasefire so that we avoid those scenarios.
What about the potential of an attack on the U.S. at home or abroad?
You can never really rule that out. And given what has happened in Gaza, there's been a lot of fears, of course, that this would be generating attacks against Western interests. So far, we have not seen it, nor have I seen any major reports that those things have been planned and were foiled or anything like that. But you cannot rule it out, and you cannot rule out what this does, not now, but perhaps 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. You're going to have a lot of young people in Gaza who have been completely radicalized, not just because of what Israel has done in terms of the bombing campaign, but also because of what the world didn't do in terms of stopping that carnage.
Trita, what else? Are there other things that we should be paying attention to? What else do we need to be looking out for?
Well, one of the things I saw, there was some question, I think, about the Israeli-Saudi normalization. That's another risk factor. On the face of it, it sounds good. It sounds as if there's going to be peace, etc. That's unfortunately not really what this is about. The Saudis are demanding a security defense pact with the United States, which would make the United States obligated to go to war on behalf of Saudi Arabia. And that dramatically increases the risk of the US getting dragged into wars. The US actually has no such agreement. It doesn't even have that with Israel, with any other country in the region, except with Turkey, because Turkey is part of NATO and the Article 4 or 5 in that treaty. It doesn't have it with anyone else. And given how Saudi Arabia has conducted itself, at least up until a couple of years ago, that's a very dangerous thing to do. Last time the United States gave a security assurance to a country of that level, I think was sometimes in the 1960s. We have it with Japan and South Korea. To do something like this is a very sure way of really reinforcing the US's military presence in the region, which is very unpopular at home and in the region, and then also giving a legal obligation to go to war. And on top of that, the US under this agreement would also offer the Saudis, hand over to the Saudis, extremely sensitive nuclear technology. The same nuclear technology that the US fought 20, 30 years to make sure that the Iranians wouldn't have, we would actually be granting it. It would be a major violation of longstanding American non-proliferation policy. And that in itself is actually escalatory, because if we sanction the Iranians not to have it and then we give it to the Saudis, any restraint on the Iranian side not to go further on their nuclear issue is probably going to fall apart. And that in and of itself then increases the likelihood of a confrontation before they have fully weaponized. So all of these, and just to give you an indication of how sensitive some of these things are, the administration had been thinking that as part of the deal, either we would post American troops around this nuclear facility in Saudi Arabia to protect it from the Saudis taking it over entirely, or we would put in place self-destruction mechanisms so that we would blow up the nuclear facility remotely. If you need to do those things, perhaps that's a warning signal that the whole thing is actually a pretty bad idea.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Iran for a second. And Iran sort of in the conflict, affecting Iran's accelerated path to nuclear weapons. A recent article in Foreign Policy argues that this conflict is increasing Iran's interest in developing nuclear weapons. What's your assessment? Do you see increased momentum?
I'm very, very worried about this at this point. The debate inside of Iran has turned, there's not a majority favoring weaponization, but the voices favoring weaponization are much stronger than they were before. And we're starting to see how the government is signaling that it may change its nuclear posture. As you know, there's a fatwa by the religious edict from the current supreme leader against nuclear weapons, building them, using them, harboring them. But now they're signaling that they may actually revise it. A sitting Ayatollah can withdraw his own fatwa. And then if that Ayatollah dies, then he has to be reinstated by a new Ayatollah. So it expires with the Ayatollah itself. But now we're talking about a situation in which he might rescind it altogether. This is very, very worrisome, but it's a direct result of the escalation that we're seeing. There's a narrative in Iran that says that had Iran had nuclear weapons, Israel would not have attacked Iran in this manner. I personally find that argument unconvincing because Israel does have nuclear weapons and Iran struck Israel. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and a couple of months ago, the Iranians fired ballistic missiles against a camp of that the Iranians considered to be terrorist organization inside of Pakistan. So the idea that nuclear weapons creates, some sort of a bulletproof deterrence against such attacks, we have ample evidence not actually working. But nevertheless, a deep frustration on the Iranian side is pushing them in this direction. And if we see this situation continue, if the Trump administration comes back and starts reimposing sanctions on Iran and things of that nature, then I fear that the escalatory path with Iranians this time around may very well involve all of this. Now, of course, we don't know, or at least I don't know how much the US intelligence knows. To what extent could the Iranians build a weapon undetected, and how fast could they do it? Would they be able to get to a weapon? If the JCPOA was in place, which it isn't any longer, at least not these elements of it, then the Iranians would not have been able to do almost anything in that regard without getting caught within 24 hours to a week. But those same inspections are not in place in Iran any longer because Trump pulled out and Biden failed to get back in. So under the current level of inspections, how much time would the Iranians need to actually weaponize? We know that they have enough material, or they would have it within a week. But having the material and having a bomb are two completely different things. Most estimates say that it might take them 2 years from having the material to having the bomb. But you can also see that potentially they may know things and do things elsewhere because we don't have the same level of inspection that would actually allow them to do it much faster. So I think this is a huge risk right now.
Well, we're looking at things that we need to watch out for to sort of in getting into a forever war. Why don't we talk about the axis of resistance, right, which is backed by Iran. It includes Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and various groups in Iraq and Syria. Where does it stand today? Has the loss of the prominent leaders weakened some of the groups, or has it increased the strength and volatility?
So without a doubt, some of these organizations have suffered some major setbacks. I don't think that the assassination of the leaders, however, are as detrimental to their strength as, for instance, the blowing up of the pagers. Because what that did is that it really compromised their communication system. And that's highly problematic for them. Leaders have come and gone. In fact, Nasrallah himself took over after the Israelis assassinated his predecessor. And he ended up being a much more effective and charismatic leader than the predecessor. And we've seen, in 2004, the Israelis assassinated Sheikh Yassin, who was the head of Hamas. And we've seen several heads of Hamas since then, but we've not seen a weakening of the organization in that sense. And particularly what is happening in Gaza, even if it's not Hamas, the radicalization is likely going to give a major boost in that direction, and perhaps even a more radical organization coming out of it. Just to give you two examples of what actually has really changed here, that I think has largely gone missed, is that it's actually our sensitivity about civilian casualties that has dramatically dropped compared to just 10, 15, 20 years ago. When under the Bush administration, the Israelis, Ariel Sharon, assassinated the then head of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin, he killed the Israelis killed 7 of Yassin's relatives in that same strike. That landed the Israelis a strong public rebuke and condemnation from the Bush administration, the same administration that Dick Cheney sat. Now the Israelis took down an entire neighborhood in Beirut to get to Nasrallah, killing hundreds of people, and received a congratulatory declaration from the Biden administration. And this was also not because suddenly the Israelis have better intelligence. In the 2006 war, on 2 occasions, the Israelis knew where Nasrallah was, tried to kill him, but the bombs could not penetrate the bunkers. This time around, what they did is that they dropped 85 2,000-pound American bombs on the entire neighborhood, killed everyone there, including, of course, penetrating the bunker, and got Nasrallah. And again, got a congratulatory message from the United States. So what's really changed here is not that, oh, suddenly they have better intelligence. What's changed here is that we used to be much more rejecting of that level of casualties, that level of destruction, and actually put pressure on the Israelis not to do those things. And under Biden, all of that has just completely gone away.
So, Trita, we have a question from Greg Gosick. He asks, does Netanyahu's firing yesterday of Defense Minister Galant increase the likelihood of conflict escalation, including additional strikes against Iran? What's your opinion?
I'm not so sure that it does, because it's not as if Galant was some sort of a peacenik within that administration. There were none. He's someone that, from the American perspective, is more preferred, but not for these reasons. This has more to do with internal Israeli politics and the fact that it was revealed in the Israeli press that not only was Netanyahu's government and a specific individual in his entourage leaking information about the war, about the negotiations in a manner to undermine the negotiations, but also that they had forged and fabricated Hamas documents, leaked it to the Israeli public to keep support up for the war. This came out in the Israeli press. And I think under those circumstances now, Netanyahu has essentially tried to protect themselves by firing several of his cabinet members that are political rivals of him. But the exact impact that that will have on the war, I don't see any evidence that it would necessarily increase or decrease. Remember, Galant is one of the people whose statements are at the very center of the International Criminal Court of Justice case against Israel on genocide charges because of statements he did. So there's a bit of a mythology in the United States, oftentimes trying to paint Netanyahu as the most hawkish, uncontrollable prime minister, but that, at the expense of everyone else around him who are different. That narrative is not really true. You have people in his administration that are far more hawkish than him. And Galant in particular, I don't think differentiates himself that much from Netanyahu in this issue.
We have a question here from Frankie. He wants to know, does weaponizing Iran with nuclear weapons shift the power in Iran from the Ayatollah to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard? Does it change the balance of power within Iran?
I think it would end up further empowering the IRGC. But that does not mean that the balance is already not in the favor of IRGC in many different ways. I think it already is. I do think that some of the elements in the IRGC think that it's not as if having nuclear weapons is some sort of a guarantee against an internal uprising. Because as we saw, the Soviet Union had tons of nuclear weapons and it still collapsed. But I think at a minimum, they think it protects them from external regime change campaigns because it's just simply too dangerous to drive actively an effort to do regime change in a country if it has nuclear weapons. But also a lot of other beliefs that they have that this actually gives them more deterrence, compellence, etc., which I think a lot of the literature on this issue and a lot of clear examples point out it's not that it doesn't change the picture, but again, I think it's a bit wishful thinking from the Iranian side to think that it will change it so much. The North Koreans have had a nuclear weapon for plus 20 years. They still haven't managed to get a deal with the United States because in some ways, they ended up having too much leverage. And even the Iranians ended up having too much leverage once they advanced the program too far, because it meant that it became too costly for the US to drive the program back to an acceptable level. The further they had gone, the more concessions the US would have to give to pull them back. At some point, it becomes too much for the US side because the administration cannot stomach that degree of concessions. And it can also not accept a smaller level of concessions because then that doesn't pull the program back sufficiently. So if the idea is that this was going to create some sort of a strong negotiating position, I think the Iranians may already have overshot just as the North Koreans did.
Let's talk a little bit about neighboring nations in what's happening in the conflict. How are neighboring nations reacting to the conflict? Is involvement from any other nations or powers imminent? Are we going to see Jordan or UAE? What's happening in the region?
What I think you've seen from all of these different countries more than anything else is desperate efforts to make sure that they are kept out. So if you take a look at, for instance, how the Israelis flew to strike at Iran on October 26th, they went through Syrian and Iraqi airspace. They avoided Saudi Arabia, they avoided Jordan, because these countries clearly pointed out they don't want to have any involvement. They knew that if their airspace was used, they could potentially become targets of the Iranians. 15 years ago, you actually had some of these states, particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia, pushing the US to go to war with Iran. That has changed since about 2018-19, because then it became clear that the Iranians actually had very significant missile capabilities. And America's ability to protect these states from those Iranian missiles is clearly insufficient. Whatever the US puts in Dubai, for instance, or UAE, is still inferior to what the US had put together with Britain and France and Italy to protect Israel. And even that was insufficient to protect the Israeli airspace from the Iranian missiles. The distance from Iran to the UAE is also much, much shorter, which makes it even more difficult. It takes about 12 minutes for the missiles to reach Israel from Iran. It will be less than half of that, which makes it even more difficult. This has made it clear to them that an alliance with the United States actually doesn't have that type of a value in the sense that it insulates them from the consequences of a war. They will pay a very heavy price if there is a war. And as a result, they've worked very hard to stay out of it. I don't think they necessarily have the leverage over Biden or over the Israelis to push them successfully towards de-escalation. But certainly, I do believe that that is what they have tried to do. But on Hamas, I think some of them have played a more of a double game. On the one hand, publicly speaking very ferociously against the war, privately, at least earlier on in the war, encouraging the Israelis to go fast because they too wanted to see Hamas destroyed.
So I have a question here, and I'm just going to ask you to answer if you can assess. It's an anonymous attendee. I don't know if that's because they put it in the chat, but I have family that lives near the center of Beirut. Are you able to assess their jeopardy of an Israeli missile attack? So I think someone who's very clearly worried about their family and wants to know if you think that they're at great risk.
I hate to be a bearer of bad news, but yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, Lebanon has very weak, if even non-existent air defense system. The Israelis have complete domination of the airspace. One of the deterrences that existed against Israel was the strength of Hezbollah. Mindful of the fact that Hezbollah has been weakened, it also means that Hezbollah's ability to impose a cost on Israel when it bombs Lebanon is much less. And as a result, we have seen how the Israelis have been striking Beirut already, even though it's mostly been the southern parts. So almost anywhere in Lebanon, just as much as almost anywhere in Syria, is highly, highly vulnerable to any attacks. And clearly, the Lebanese public do not want this war. There's large elements of the Israeli public, Lebanese public, that disagree with the position of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has refused a ceasefire unless it is tied to a ceasefire in Gaza. And there's elements in Lebanon who believe that, just go along with any type of a ceasefire, even if it doesn't stop the war in Gaza, you have to save Lebanon. And there's others who believe that at the end of the day, even if you agree to that, it's only a question of time before the Israelis would attack again. So they don't find such an agreement to be stable. I tend to believe that there is some validity in the second part because, again, we're seeing the continuation of the fighting in Gaza fuel conflict elsewhere consistently. So even if you get a temporary end between Israel and Lebanon, just as much as we get a temporary end between Israel and Iran, it likely will not go away fully until you have a ceasefire in Gaza.
So another question from Mark. He wants to know if we actually get a ceasefire in Gaza, is there a path forward? Or is it a situation where we just have a timeout and then we're back to the conflict? So what happens if we actually get a ceasefire?
So as you know, there was a ceasefire for 6 days back in last November. Unfortunately, it was too short of a ceasefire to really ensure that the cost of going back to fighting was too high. I do think that a ceasefire obviously is very crucial, even though the next steps may be somewhat difficult to hash out beforehand, because we're talking about an ongoing massacre of civilians right now that needs to be stopped, regardless of how well we know what the path is after that. But I think once you do get a ceasefire that is longer, you're going to have to deal with some very, very serious issues of who governs Gaza, um, uh, how it's rebuilt, how do you deal with the humanitarian crisis. I fear that not having a ceasefire increases the likelihood, and this is something we're seeing increasingly now, particularly mindful of what the Israelis said yesterday, that they believe that they have what they call it is that northern Gaza has now successfully been totally evacuated, which essentially means ethnically cleansed, and that paves the way for an annexation of Gaza. And that's just going to deepen the conflict. Ultimately, none of this is going to stop until there is finally a two-state solution between both a safe Israel and a safe Palestine next to each other. All of this fighting, particularly all of the annexation and further control of territory, just makes that more distant, more difficult, and as a result, prolongs the conflict as a whole.
So we do have a question in the Q&A, and I'll pose it two ways. So someone is saying, geez, is there any good news? Jude, is there any hope here? What do you think?
It's been an extremely depressing year. Good news. Wow. When did we hear any good news? Yeah, no, let me put it this way. On the one hand, the human suffering is just intolerable. And that's obviously terrible, terrible. And just the number of children who have no limbs, have no parents, just dealing with all of that is going to be traumatic for a generation or two. On the other hand, I do have to say that there seems to be a much stronger international opinion, unfortunately not reached the US in the same way yet, at least not the corridors of power in the US, recognizing that we really need to get serious about an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on, and this is critical, based on the deoccupation of Palestine, meaning that there has to be an enforced solution in which the occupation ends. Not a situation in which the Israelis and the Palestinians, with this massive power imbalance between them, negotiates a final deal. This has been the American formula for the last 30 years, and it's not worked because the imbalance of power is just so overwhelming. There was a resolution, the ICJ made a ruling earlier this summer, I think in July, 18th of July or so, ruling the illegality of the occupation and the settlements. And this was then adopted in a UN General Assembly resolution that called for an end of the occupation within 12 months. And it passed overwhelmingly. Unfortunately, the US again was against it. So you're seeing a consolidation of international opinion on this, that we need a different formula. It cannot be a negotiated settlement. It has to be based on 1967 lines. It has to be a deoccupation. And it's not a negotiation between two completely imbalanced partners, but something that actually is imposed exactly as the creation of Israel itself was imposed. That was imposed by the UN in 1948. And now you may have to have the same thing in the creation of a Palestinian state. That doesn't mean that everything is going to be fine and dandy, but it's going to at least take us to a completely different plateau. Anyone who thinks that further annexation and occupation of Palestinian territory will create buffer zones that will make Israel safe, I have to say I find it to be a delusional theory, given the fact that you have had such an expansion of settlements and occupation for the last 30 years, and yet October 7th happened.
Now, I know we're starting to run short on time, so I'm going to ask my last question. And I also want to ask you to end with any closing thoughts you might have for us. But I want to ask about the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and its sort of stance on whether or not, what's your assessment? Is the U.S. really entering into another forever war? But I think it's important to note the Quincy Institute's mission includes the rethinking American foreign policy with an emphasis on diplomatic engagement and a de-emphasis on military intervention. There's a great quote on your website by John Quincy Adams reminding us that America goes not abroad in search of monsters. So Trita, how are you and the Quincy Institute viewing this ongoing conflict? And what do you think is the potential of the U.S., the real true potential of the U.S. entering the forever war? And maybe the answer today is different than the answer was yesterday, right?
I think it's a significant worry. I think the American public is largely unaware that we still have about 50,000 troops in the Middle East, scattered along 19 bases. And in many ways, many of these bases are essentially sitting ducks with numerous militias pointing their weapons and guns at them. And at any moment, terrible things can happen. Now, let me give you an example. On October 26th last year, there was an attack by an Iraqi militia against the air base in Erbil, 5 a.m. in the morning, and the air defenses of this base failed, and the drone hit the barracks where American troops were sleeping. But out of a pure miracle, it malfunctioned and didn't explode. You could have had, I don't know, scores of American deaths on that day, and that would have dragged us into a war. And every day since then, President Biden knew that when he gets his morning briefing, that piece of news could have been the case. That, this next time we didn't get lucky and actually people would have gotten killed. This is what is so difficult for me to wrap my head around, why Biden was so willing to accept that risk for so long. And we will continue to do so as long as we're having this posture in which we think that we need to have so many troops in the region in the midst of these different war zones. And despite the fact that we have some excellent diplomats, our diplomacy doesn't have much credibility. Because again, we're not seen as impartial brokers. We're seen as being squarely on the side of Israel, arming, protecting it diplomatically. This ultimately doesn't add security to us. I find it problematic that the Chinese can come in and strike a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia and be welcomed by both sides, but we don't have the capacity to do so any longer because we lack the credibility. I think that lack of diplomatic power that has come as a direct result of the militarization of our foreign policy really undermines American security. And this is a process that we've seen for the last 20 or 30 years. We are no longer the country that can talk to almost everyone in these different regions and whose diplomacy is seen as something that binds the region together, that is indispensable, that helps ensure peace. That's simply not how we're seen. The standing of the United States in the Middle East, and particularly over the course of the last year, by almost every senior official I've spoken to from Arab countries, most of them strong allies of the US, they keep on saying something that I hear over and over again. Our standing is lower than it was during the Iraq War. And that says a lot.
It's pretty startling. Any final thoughts for us, Trita?
Yes, the final thought, I'll try to put it on a positive thing. There is a good piece of news of this, which is all of this is actually in our control. We're not destined to pursue this type of approach. There's not structural factors that leaves us with no other option but to do it this way. We can change this around. I'm not saying it's easy, but we have the capacity to do so. And in some ways, I do think that if both parties, frankly, listen more to the American people, we would be moving in that direction. I find it startling that Trump could say, as I talked earlier on, the killing must stop. But Harris had such a difficulty doing so. Imagine if both parties were willing to say things of this kind because they were actually trying to get the American voter, the majority American voter who wants to see far less war and far more investment here at home. I think we would end up in a much better situation. It's the thing that we at the Quincy Institute would like to see, because what Quincy Adams said, John Quincy Adams said in 1821 in that speech. He pointed out that we don't go in search of monsters abroad to destroy, but if we do, we may become the dictatresses of the world, he said, but it will come at the expense of our own freedom and liberty. And that is the trend we have seen over and over again in history, in which countries are constantly at war. It comes at the expense of the freedom of their own citizens.
Trita, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And
My
as
pleasure.
you are welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone for joining us. This discussion is part of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut virtual series. If you'd like to revisit or share this event, make sure you subscribe to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut on YouTube. This event will be posted in the coming week. And in the meantime, you can check out all of our past events. Coming up, we'll be hosting events on the digital divide, the growing alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and culture events including a holiday festive dinner and the diplomat reception, and of course, our celebration in honor of International Women's Day. We invite you to join us and make sure you don't miss any event. Go to our website, ctwac.org, subscribe to our YouTube channel at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. Once again, thank you so much, Trita, for sharing your leadership, and thank you all of us for joining us. Until next time, everyone.
Thank you.